There are things you don't forget. Not because you try to remember them, not because you write them down or tell the story at every campfire you find yourself sitting beside. You don't forget them because they carve something into you. They find the soft place inside your chest where your assumptions live, all those quiet, comfortable beliefs you never questioned, and they dig in deep. They rearrange things, and when they're done, you are not the same person you were before. I was 31 years old when I stopped being afraid of the galaxy. And I want to be clear about something right from the start. I wasn't brave. I wasn't special. I wasn't some chosen warrior with enhanced genetics or classified military training or a destiny written in the stars. I was a cargo surveyor. My name is Marin Voss. I cataloged shipping containers for a living. I read manifests. I argued with dock managers about weight discrepancies. I drank terrible coffee from thermal flasks, and I spent most of my time in the belly of freight haulers that smelled like machine oil and recycled air. That's who I was. That's the person two dying dragons watched walk out of a blizzard on a moon. So cold the atmosphere was basically a formality. I want you to understand that before we go any further, because what happened on Keeley's 7 didn't happen to a hero. It happened to me. A regular person. Someone who was terrified the entire time and did it anyway because the alternative was lying down in the snow and waiting to stop existing. That's the only kind of brave that counts, I think. The kind where you're scared all the way through. Part 1, the manifest. It started with a number that didn't add up. That's almost always how the worst days start, isn't it? Not with alarms or explosions or some dramatic moment of crisis. They start with something small, a figure that's slightly off. A detail that nags at you. A number in a column that doesn't match the number in the adjacent column, and you know it should, and you can't let it go. I was 3 weeks into a rotation aboard the HFY Marin, which, yes, shares my name. And no, that's not a coincidence. I helped register her, long story, a mid-range bulk hauler running the outer Meridian supply chain. We were scheduled to make a drop at Keeley's station, which orbited the gas giant Keeley's Prime in a system that had exactly 2 things going for it. A decent navigational beacon, and absolutely nothing else of interest. The station was small, a waypoint really, fuel, basic supplies, mail transfer, crew rotation. The kind of place that exists because space is very large and people need places to stop in the middle of it. Our cargo manifest listed 14,236 units of compressed nutrient block, standard humanitarian resupply, destined for a refugee processing settlement on the far side of the system. 14,236. I'd checked it twice. The dock manager at our origin point, a cheerful Vethosi named Greel who had 17 fingers and used all of them simultaneously on every keyboard he touched, had signed off on it personally. What the dock records showed when I pulled the raw data, the actual raw data, not the formatted summary, was 14,203. 33 units missing, which doesn't sound like much. 33 units out of 14,000. That's a rounding error. That's what most people would say, and most people would be right, and I would have been one of those people if I hadn't been doing this job for 6 years and learned the hard way that small discrepancies in cargo manifests are almost never actually small. They're either a data entry error, which is harmless and annoying, or they're evidence that someone has been pulling product out of the hold before it reaches its destination. The refugee settlement was waiting on those nutrient blocks. There were families on the other side of that supply chain. So I did what I always do when a number doesn't add up. I went to go look at the actual cargo. The hold on the HFY Marin was divided into 7 sections, each one about the size of a small warehouse. Section 4 was where the nutrient blocks were packed, floor to ceiling in vacuum-sealed pallets with thermal regulators running along the walls. The lighting was that particular shade of pale blue-white that all cargo holds seem to use, the kind that makes everything look slightly clinical, like the inside of a very large refrigerator. I'd been in 1,000 holds that looked exactly like this. I almost didn't see the hatch. It was behind pallet row 19. You had to turn sideways to get between the pallets and the wall, and most cargo surveyors don't bother. If the pallet's sealed and tagged, it's fine, move on. But I'm on the shorter side and I don't mind tight spaces, so I squeezed through, running my scanner along the baseboards looking for a tag discrepancy. The hatch was in the floor, small, roughly 1 meter square. It had been painted over badly, and the paint was cracked along the seam in a way that told you someone had opened it recently. I stood there for probably 30 seconds just looking at it. Then I opened it. The space below was maybe 4 meters deep. A maintenance crawlway, technically, the kind that exists in every ship for access to ventral sensor arrays and hull inspection systems. They're not supposed to be habitable. They're not climate-controlled. They're not pressurized to anything above the minimum necessary to keep the sensors running. But someone had put in a heating coil, and a bedroll, and a water recycler. And 2 creatures that were, even in the cramped and inadequate light of my handheld torch, clearly not human. They were chained to the hull. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean there were actual physical restraints, dark metal, thick as my wrist, connected to anchor points that had been bolted into the hull plating with the kind of institutional permanence that suggested this hadn't been a rushed decision. Whoever had put them here had meant for them to stay. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but larger, significantly larger. Even curled in the limited space, I could tell that standing upright they'd have been well over 2 meters. Their skin, if that was the right word, was somewhere between scale and shell, a dark graphite color that caught the light in overlapping geometric patterns. Their faces were angular and long, with high cheekbones and eyes that, when they opened at the sound of my hatch, glowed a deep and steady amber. Like coals, the kind that have been burning for a long time. One of them, the one on the left, had a wound on its upper arm that had been bandaged with what looked like strips torn from a thermal blanket. The bandage was dark with dried blood. The other had similar coloring but was clearly younger, smaller, leaner. Its amber eyes were brighter, more reactive, the way young things are always more reactive to everything. They both stared at me. I stared at them. And then the older one, very slowly, with the deliberate carefulness of something that is in pain and trying not to show it, said, in accented but perfectly clear galactic common, "Are you going to report us?" I did not report them. I don't know what that says about me. Probably a few different things, not all of them flattering from a regulatory standpoint. But I looked at those chains, and I looked at that wound, and I looked at the way they were rationing what little water they had. The recycler tank was nearly empty, and there was a careful line scratched into it at a level that was clearly the designated, "Do not go below this" mark, and something in me went very still. I'd seen people traffic before, not often, not up close, but I'd seen the documentation. I'd heard the stories. I'd done mandatory sensitivity training that showed the signs. The signs were all there. They were being transported without records. There was no manifest entry for living cargo, nothing that would show up in any port authority check. The hold space had been modified specifically to hide them, and the chains weren't there to keep them from hurting themselves. "No," I said, "I'm not going to report you." The younger one's amber eyes flickered. Something moved in its expression, something I couldn't quite name yet, not knowing their faces, not knowing what their emotions looked like when they moved through their features. But it looked like relief. The older one just watched me, assessing. "What are you?" I asked, and then immediately felt like an idiot because that's a terrible question, and I corrected myself. "I mean, who are you? What's your species? Where are you from?" "Drakenathi," the older one said. It pronounced it with a weight on the middle syllable, Drakenath. "From the Vish territories, my name is Sorvith, this is Kale." The younger one, Kale, tilted its head at me with an expression that, on a human face, would have been a cautious half-smile. On its angular features, it came out as a slight relaxation around the jaw and a brief brightening of those amber eyes. "Where are they taking you?" I asked. A pause. Sorvith and Kale exchanged a look. One of those looks that carries an entire conversation between people who know each other well. "We don't know," Sorvith said. "We knew where we were being taken 4 days ago. We do not know if that destination has changed." 4 days in a maintenance crawlway, with 1 thermal blanket and a nearly empty water recycler and a wound that needed medical attention. I thought about the 33 missing nutrient units. I thought about how easy it would have been to miss this hatch. I thought about how I almost didn't squeeze behind pallet row 19. "Okay," I said. "I'm going to bring you water, and I'm going to bring you food. And then I need you to tell me everything, because I have about 14 hours before we dock at Keeley's station, and I need to understand what I'm dealing with." It took 2 trips to fill their recycler and bring enough nutrient blocks to actually constitute a meal. On the second trip, I brought my first aid kit, which is a compact civilian model designed for scraped knuckles and minor burns, and absolutely nothing approaching what Sorvith's arm wound actually needed. But I cleaned it and redressed it as best I could, and Sorvith allowed this with the stillness of something that has learned not to flinch. Then I sat cross-legged on the floor of the crawlway, which was deeply uncomfortable and smelled like machine coolant, and I listened. The Draknathi, as Sorvith explained it, were one of the older species in the local cluster. Not the oldest, there were things older, things that didn't even bother to interact with younger civilizations, things that existed at timescales that made conventional politics irrelevant. But the Draknathi had been building cities when humanity was still trying to figure out agriculture. They had a civilization that stretched across 7 systems in the Vish territories, a culture that valued something Sorvith called Vurath, which translated loosely to earned weight, or the accumulation of wisdom through experience, which carried social currency in their society. They were also, Sorvith said quietly, currently losing a war. Not a military war, something more complicated. A political and economic war, the kind where the battles happen in boardrooms and treaty negotiations, and the casualties are measured in displaced populations and confiscated territories. A conglomerate, a multi-species commercial and political organization that Sorvith referred to only as the Syndicate, with the flat tone of someone who has learned not to say the full name in places they're not certain are safe, had been systematically acquiring sovereignty claims in the Vish territories through a combination of debt acquisition, political manipulation, and when those failed, more direct methods. The Draknathi had resources, rare mineral deposits in their outer moons, gravitational anomalies in their deeper systems that made them strategically valuable for certain kinds of transit. And they had something else, something that I didn't fully understand at first. "We are long-lived," Sorvith said, "and we remember, not just personally, institutionally. Our elders carry records that go back further than most civilizations have existed. The Syndicate wants those records." "Why?" "Because history is leverage," Kale said. It was the first full sentence the younger Draknathi had spoken, and it came out with a precision that suggested Kale had been thinking about it for a while. "If you know what actually happened, not the version that was written down by the people who won, you know where the claims are, where the debts are, where the promises were made and broken. You know who owes what to whom, going back centuries. And the Syndicate wants that," I said slowly, "because it would give them everything," Sorvith said simply. "It would give them the legal and historical foundation to claim sovereignty over approximately 2/3 of the outer Meridian transit network, including Keely's station." I sat with that for a moment. "And you too are?" "Archivists," Sorvith said. "In our culture, the title carries more weight than in yours. We don't just store information. We are its custodians. We carry it in ways that cannot be digitally copied or corrupted." I looked at Kale, younger, brighter-eyed, still with that careful quality of something watching and absorbing. "How old are you?" I asked. 43 of your years," Kale said. Which, I would later learn, made Kale essentially a teenager in Draknathi terms. "Someone took you from the Vish territories," I said, "and they're moving you where to extract what you know." Sorvith's jaw tightened. "There are methods, not pleasant. We have protections, neurological barriers that require our cooperation to circumvent. The Syndicate believes they have found a facility where those barriers can be bypassed." The silence after that sentence had weight. "Okay," I said after a moment. "Okay. We have 14 hours. Part 2, CALYS station." The station looked like every other waypoint station in the outer Meridian. A ring and a hub, and a bunch of docking arms sticking out at irregular angles. The way space infrastructure always ends up when it's been expanded and patched, and expanded again over decades without anyone sitting down to make a coherent plan. There were 37 ships docked or in approach when we arrived. The station housed a permanent population of about 400, mostly dock workers and maintenance crews, and the small bureaucratic apparatus required to keep a waypoint running. There was a med bay. There was a customs post with 2 officers who did not look like they had ever had an interesting day in their professional lives. And there was, according to the shipping records I'd quietly pulled during our transit, a vessel called the Keth Varas docked at Arm 14. The Kethvaras was registered as a research and logistics vessel out of a port I'd never heard of in a system that was technically within the Vish territories, but sat right at the border of what Sorvith had described as contested space. Its manifest was clean, exactly the kind of clean that takes effort to maintain, the kind of clean that is itself a little suspicious if you know what you're looking at. I knew what I was looking at. I spent the 3 hours before docking sitting in my cabin running the numbers, cross-referencing port records, tracking the Kethvara's last 18 months of movement. It had made 11 stops in the outer meridian in the past year. 7 of those stops were at locations that, when I plotted them on a system map, formed a loose circuit around the Vish territories. 4 of those 7 locations had reported missing persons incidents in the 6 months following each visit. I'm a cargo surveyor. I'm not a detective, but I can read a pattern. The question was what to do with the pattern. The station had a communications array. I could send a message. To who? Port Authority? Port Authority at Keeley's station consisted of the 2 board customs officers. Galactic Oversight. Their nearest active office was 11 days away. The Vish territorial government. They were, per everything Sorvith had told me, currently engaged in the process of being systematically dismantled, and their external communications were almost certainly monitored. I sat in my cabin for a long time. Then I went back to the hold. I need to ask you something, I told Sorvith, and I need an honest answer. I have given you nothing but honest answers, Sorvith said. The amber eyes were steady. That steadiness, I was beginning to understand, wasn't coldness. It was the kind of deep calm that comes from age, from having seen enough things that you've stopped being surprised by the shape of a crisis. When they dock, I said, when the syndicate people come to collect you, what happens? What's the actual sequence of events? Sorvith and Kale exchanged another one of those looks. They will board the Kelthais Marin with documentation showing they have a right to take custody, Sorvith said. The documentation will be convincing. Your captain will cooperate. They will take us to the Kethvaras. After that. After that is the part we do not think about, Kale said quietly. I nodded. There's a moon, I said. Keeley 7. It's in the surveys as uninhabited. Atmosphere's thin, surface temperature is usually around -80, which is why nobody lives there. But there's a survey station on the northern continent from a geological team that pulled out 3 years ago. The equipment's still there. Emergency heating units, survival rations, long-range comms with emergency beacon capability. They both looked at me. It's 800 kilometers from the station, I said. I can get us a transport, something small, something that doesn't need to file a full departure manifest if I list it as a system survey run. I do those regularly, nobody questions them. We have a 2-hour window after docking before the Kethvaras sends their people over. Sorvith was quiet for a long moment. You are risking a great deal, it said. I know. You could simply have reported finding us. You would have faced no consequences. Possibly. Why didn't you? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the 33 missing units. I thought about the families waiting at the settlement. I thought about the word Vurith, earned weight, and what it meant to carry information that could not be corrupted. Because you're people, I said, and someone's trying to take something from you that can't be given back. I don't need a better reason than that. Kale made a sound. It was low and resonant, more vibration than noise. I felt it more than I heard it. Later, Sorvith would tell me it was the Draknathi equivalent of someone pressing a hand over their heart. The chains, I said, how strong are they? You don't have the tools to remove them here. No, but there's a cutting torch in the maintenance bay. Getting the chains off took 40 minutes and was the loudest, most nerve-wracking experience I'd had in a decade of cargo work. The cutting torch was designed for hull repairs and was, therefore, extremely effective, but also extremely loud. I worked as fast as I could while Sorvith held Kale's arm still, and we all listened to the sounds of the Kelthais Marin going through its docking procedure above us. The moment the last link gave way, Kale straightened. Even in the cramped crawlway, even without the full space to unfold into, there was something in the way the younger Draknathi's spine aligned, something in the set of the shoulders, that was different from the curled, compressed creature I'd found 4 days after the fact. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, but it was the kind of thing you notice when you're watching closely. Sorvith, for its part, looked at its freed wrists for a long moment. Then it looked at me. "There is something you should know," it said. "Now, it is relevant to your plan. Tell me on the transport." The transport, a battered six-person survey skiff called, charmingly, Box of Stars, was docked at Arm 7. I'd used it 3 times in this rotation for genuine system surveys, so my authorization codes were active and current. I filed the departure as a geological transit to Keeley's 5, which was where my last legitimate survey had been, and I changed the logged destination in the navigation system to Keeley's 7 once we were out of the station's comm range, which gave us about 40 minutes in transit to have the conversation Sorvith had promised. I was in the pilot's seat. Sorvith was in the co-pilot chair. It barely fit, its knees pressing against the console, its head at an angle to avoid the overhead panels. Cale had folded into the rear cabin with the kind of flexible efficiency that suggested the last 4 days in a maintenance crawlway had been practice. "What do I need to know?" I asked. Sorvith folded its hands in its lap. Those hands were remarkable, long-fingered and very precise, with an extra joint at the second knuckle. "The records we carry," it said. "They are not metaphorical." I glanced over. "What do you mean?" I said we remember in ways that cannot be digitally copied. "This is literal." Sorvith turned its left palm upward. In the pale dashboard light, I could see that the scale pattern on the inner wrist was slightly different from the surrounding skin, more regular, more geometric, like a circuit. "The Drake-Nathi have a biological process that doesn't translate cleanly into any other language. The closest equivalent in galactic common is inscription. We inscribe information into living tissue. Specific pathways in the nervous system carry specific data. Not memory, data. Precise, unalterable, verifiable data." I stared at the wrist, then at Sorvith's face. "Your biological data storage," I said. "We prefer the term archivists," Sorvith said, with what I could now identify as a distinctly dry quality in its voice. "The Syndicate wants to extract data from your nervous system." "Yes. That's why they need the facility." "Yes. Is the process," I stopped, chose a different word, "does it damage you?" A pause. "The Syndicate's facility uses a method that has not been extensively tested," Sorvith said carefully. "The Drake-Nathi scholars who have reviewed the known documentation estimate that the extraction process would likely compromise the neurological integrity of the subject." "They'd burn out your brain," I said flatly. "In simplified terms, yes." I turned back to the navigation display. Keeley's 7 was coming up on the sensor range, a pale smudge in the far blue-black, wrapped in a faint atmospheric shimmer that meant cold. Very cold. "And Cale," I asked quietly, "how much data does Cale carry?" "Cale is a senior archivist candidate," Sorvith said. "In our society, training begins early. Cale has been carrying inscribed data for 11 of your years. The records Cale holds represent, in terms of historical depth, approximately 3,000 years of continuous archival information pertaining to territorial claims in the northern Vish systems. 3,000 years. In the bones of someone who looked, by their own species' reckoning, like a teenager. "Right," I said, "right, okay." The navigation chimed. Keeley's 7 was coming into orbital approach. "You should know one more thing," Sorvith said. "Of course there's more. The Syndicate will have realized we are missing before we reach the surface. The Kethvaras will likely be in communication with the crew of the Kelthai's Marin within the next 30 minutes. When it becomes clear that a survey skiff departed the station shortly before our absence was discovered, they'll know where we went. They will narrow down the likely destination significantly, yes." I looked at the sensor display. Box of Stars was a survey skiff. It had basic environmental systems and a sensor array rated for geological work, and it had exactly no defensive capability whatsoever. "How fast is the Kethvaras?" I asked. "Fast enough," Sorvith said. "Part 3, the surface. Keeley's 7 didn't want us there. That's the only way I can describe the way the atmosphere received us. The descent was in the skiff's automated hands. I'd filed the approach parameters and let the nav system work, and still it felt like the planet itself was pushing back. Turbulence hit us 3 kilometers above the cloud layer and didn't stop. The temperature sensors on the hull went from reading acceptable to reading alarming in about 11 seconds. The wind shear at 2 kilometers was 60 meters per second, which is the kind of number that looks manageable on a display until you're inside the thing that's being sheared. "Is this normal?" Cale asked from the rear cabin. Its voice was very even. "For Keely 7, yes," I said. "It's why nobody lives here. And we chose to come here because the survey station has a long-range emergency beacon that broadcasts on frequencies the Syndicate would have to explain to 7 different galactic oversight bodies why they were jamming. It's our best chance at getting a message out to someone who can actually do something." A pause. "That is a very thin plan," Cale said. "It's the one we have." The cloud layer closed around us like a fist, and for about 2 minutes the world outside the canopy was nothing but white and gray, and the occasional flash of what the sensors insisted was atmospheric lightning, but which sounded, through the hull, more like something tearing. Then we broke through. The surface of Keely's 7 opened up below us, and it was, I don't know how to describe it except to say it was enormous in the way that only truly empty places can be. White, flat, broken up by a mountain range to the north that was the color of old iron and so sharp-edged it looked carved. The wind was already sculpting the snow into forms, long, reaching ridges that swept out from the mountain bases like fingers. The survey station was in the foothills of that range. The nav system found it, a cluster of low structures, solar thermal collectors now buried under 2 seasons of accumulation, the dome of the comms array still poking up above the snow line. We set down 200 meters out, because the pad itself was invisible under the snow, and I didn't trust the landing sensors to find a solid surface in that mess. The moment I opened the hatch, the cold came in like a wall. -78, the suit sensor said, wind chill making it functionally -90. I had a survival suit. Every cargo surveyor carries one as standard kit. It was rated to -60, which was encouraging in the way that a life jacket rated to calm water is encouraging when you are already in a storm. Sorvith and Cale had nothing. Their environmental tolerances, Sorvith had told me, were better than human but not by enough to matter at this temperature. "There are emergency insulation packs in the rear storage," I said. "Rated for geological survey work in hostile environments. They're not designed for your body shape, but they'll." "We have managed worse," Sorvith said, and there was something in the tone that stopped my next sentence. I looked at Sorvith, at the injured arm, at the 4 days in a crawlway set of the shoulders, at the quiet, settled way the older Draknathi moved, like every movement was a conscious decision made without waste. Sorvith had managed worse, I believed it. We wrapped them in everything available, the insulation packs, the emergency thermal blankets, a spare environment suit liner that fit approximately nowhere properly but added a meaningful layer. And then we walked. 200 meters in -78 degrees Celsius, with 60 meter per second wind. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't remember it as individual steps. I remember it as a single sustained experience of cold and wind, and the effort of moving through air that felt like it was trying to steal the warmth directly out of my body through any gap it could find. I remember Cale, at some point, pulling Sorvith's good arm over its shoulder, because Sorvith was favoring the injured arm and the terrain was uneven, and the snow was deeper than expected. I remember thinking, even through the cold, that there was something in that gesture that was very recognizable regardless of species. The station door was magnetic sealed, and the mechanism was frozen solid. I had a suit tool with a heating element, and I spent what felt like forever, was actually about 4 minutes, working the mechanism warm enough to respond. The door gave with a sound like something cracking, and we fell inside. The interior temperature of the survey station was -20, which felt, after outside, like stepping into something almost comfortable. The emergency heating units were functional. The solar thermal collectors had been keeping the core systems alive, barely, for 3 years of abandonment. I got the main heating element running in about 8 minutes, and the temperature inside began its slow climb toward something livable. Sorvith sat against the wall and was very still. The injured arm was against its body, held close, and the amber eyes were slightly dimmer than they'd been on the ship. Not out, but lower. Cale crouched next to Sorvith, and they did the thing I'd noticed before, exchanged a look that carried a full conversation. Then Cale looked up at me. "Sorvith needs the wound cleaned properly," Cale said. The environment on the ship was not sterile. "I know," I said. "I'll do it. Let the temperature come up first." I went to the comms array. The survey station's equipment was 3 years old and had been running on minimal power maintenance since the geological team pulled out. The long-range beacon was intact. That was the first thing I checked. It was broadcasting a standard empty station signal on emergency frequencies, which was exactly what I needed. I could modify that signal, add a data package, send something specific. The question was who to send it to. I sat in front of the comms console for a long time, thinking about that question. The obvious answer was some kind of galactic law enforcement or oversight body, but Sorvith had been very clear about the Syndicate's reach. The reason the Kelthai's Marin crew had cooperated with the chain installation, the reason the manifest had been doctored, the reason 12 different port-of-call records had been quietly adjusted, was that the Syndicate had people in a lot of places. Not everywhere, but enough. Broadcasting a wide signal on emergency frequencies would reach the Syndicate before it reached anyone who could help. I needed something targeted, something that would reach the right people without announcing our location to everyone else first. I was 3 years out of date on Vish territorial politics, but Sorvith had given me names during the transit. Specific people. A council member named Vithais who had been coordinating external communications for the resistance movement within the territories. A galactic oversight inspector named Chen Yaoren who had been investigating syndicate activities in the Outer Meridian for 18 months. An independent journalist embedded with a news network that the Syndicate hadn't yet figured out how to shut down. I encoded a data package, location, status, names, the pattern I'd mapped from the Kethvaras movement logs, everything Sorvith had told me, and I formatted it as 3 separate directed transmissions on 3 separate frequencies. Tight beam, high encryption, piggybacking on the emergency beacon's existing frequencies so they'd look, on a surface scan, like background noise in the beacon's signal. Then I pressed send and sat back and listened to the wind against the station walls. "Can I ask you something?" Kale said. It was maybe an hour later. The temperature inside had climbed to +4, which was not warm but was survivable. I'd redressed Sorvith's arm with the proper supplies from the station's emergency medical kit, which was substantially more complete than my field kit. The wound was deep, it had been infected, and I'd flushed it with everything the kit had, but Sorvith's biology was doing something I could only describe as remarkable. The tissue around the wound was already visibly beginning to consolidate, like watching something heal in fast forward. Drakenathi biology, I was learning, had its own opinions about injury. I was sitting on the other side of the heating unit, eating a nutrient block that tasted exactly like cardboard with optimistic seasoning, watching the sensor array for any sign of incoming vessels. "Sure," I said. Kale was quiet for a moment, assembling the question. "Why do humans do that?" it asked finally. "Do what specifically?" When there is danger, when the logical calculation of risk and reward suggests that withdrawal is the rational choice, humans frequently choose to remain, to engage, Kale searched for the word, to insert themselves into situations that are not theirs. I thought about it. "I don't think it's a human thing specifically," I said. "I think it's a person thing. Some people do it, some don't. But in the records we carry, across 3,000 years of archived data pertaining to the species of the Outer Meridian, humans appear to do it disproportionately, even when it is irrational, even when the personal risk is significant." "Maybe we're bad at math," I said. Kale's amber eyes caught the light from the heating unit and held it. "Sorvith thinks it's something else," Kale said. I looked at Sorvith. The older Drakenathi was resting with its eyes partially closed, but it was listening. I'd noticed it was always listening, even when it appeared to be elsewhere. "What do you think it is?" I asked. Sorvith was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think humans have a very short memory." "That's not a compliment." "It is not an insult either. It is an observation." The amber eyes opened more fully. "Long-lived species accumulate precedent. We know in detail how situations like this have ended before. We carry that knowledge. It makes us cautious, perhaps too cautious." A pause. "Humans forget quickly. You are not burdened by your own past in the same way. Every crisis is, to some degree, new. And because it is new, you approach it without the weight of knowing that it has failed before." You're saying we're brave because we're not paying attention. I'm saying, Sorvith said carefully, that there may be a form of courage that comes precisely from not knowing all the reasons why something is impossible. I sat with that. For what it's worth, I said, I was terrified the entire time. Yes, Sorvith said, that's what makes it courage. The sensor array chimed at hour 3. I was at the console before the chime finished. 2 contacts coming in fast from the orbital direction. One was large, the Kethvaras. The other was smaller but moving faster. I watched the display and I thought about what options I had, and the honest answer was, very few. The station had no weapons. The box of stars had no weapons. I had a tool kit and a medical kit and about 200 nutrient blocks and the emergency beacon, which was already broadcasting. They found us, I said. Kale was beside me in 2 steps, looked at the display, looked at me. How long? At their current approach speed, 20 minutes to orbit, less if they have a fast shuttle. What do we do? I looked at the display. I looked at the encoded transmissions still showing as sent on the comms board. I looked at the timestamp on the send log. We've been broadcasting for 2 hours and 40 minutes, I said. The nearest galactic oversight relay is, I pulled up the network map, 43 minutes away at emergency response speed. If they received the message and responded immediately. Which is a significant if, Kale said. Which is a significant if, I agreed. The wind outside was doing something that sounded, through the station walls, like shouting. Okay, I said, here's what we're going to do.